Zeppelin were the masters of getting the balance right with their music. You know, there was always light and shade to their records.
Where they were brilliant was with some of these epic tracks that they used to write, or some of the heavy blues stuff. You know, that was pure Zeppelin, absolutely brilliant.
Excess was a rule of thumb, you know, it just was. You know, we're going to be bigger, we're going to be better.
An incredible amalgamation of hugely individual talents which came together and coalesced in a way that almost cannot be described.
They defined the 70s for me.
If you split the Zepp career in two, the first 4 albums, you know, they're exploded out of the blocks, then they're finding their feet and understanding who they are. They reach that point with Led Zepp 4. From then on, you know, they can't repeat themselves, so they've got to keep on pushing the boundaries out. And that's what you start to hear in Houses of the Holies.
I can remember getting the album as a birthday present. It just blew my mind. It was just the most incredible thing.
After the critical acclaim that was heaped upon Led Zeppelin 4, Houses of the Holy got a bit of a muted response at the time from the critics and the fans, basically because it was the first time Led Zeppelin had dared to sort of move away from the whole, you know, the rock blueprint.
The album itself seemed a little bit more fragmented than Led Zeppelin 4, which had a great cohesion to it, a real power, you know, a real sort of brooding intensity. This one was a collection of separate songs, really. Didn't really seem to have that kind of consistency.
It was really a period where they were beginning to mature musically, and I think that reflected in how the album felt. Whether it was what Led Zeppelin fans expected didn't matter to them, and I think that's the important thing. They were pleasing themselves, and creatively they needed to do that.
People thought up until that point they knew exactly what to expect of Led Zeppelin, balls out rock and roll, and of course they moved into all these other areas and it just confused people.
You know, the crudge do you make all a bit sort of tongue-in-cheek. The crudge coming from an idea of an impossible dance, and they even toyed with the idea of putting the dance steps on the album cover, so that, you know, to show that, you know. So I think they were just having fun.
Jamaica, obviously, the reggae number, and the crunge are two quite bizarre tracks. Jamaica, apparently the Americans didn't get it all. And could you play Diamaker, because they didn't understand the pun in the name. And the crunge is just impossible to play, and it makes you realise what a phenomenal band they are.
At a time in the mid-70s, early to mid-70s, when most people in the UK didn't really have an idea about reggae, they introduced that sound through Jamaica.
Jamaica is a fantastic track. You know, a lot of people have called it cod reggae, you know, which is just harsh. That's kind of saying if you're white, you can't play reggae music. You know, well, Bob Marley also played rock music. So, you know, it's bollocks, basically.
To my soul.
It was purely those throwaway tracks, Jamaica, the crunge, which seemed to me, and probably weren't, thrown together in the studio. There was probably a lot of thought going behind it, and subsequent reviews, you know, when the album's come out and it's been remastered or stuck on CD, have claimed that you know, Zeppelin were being really bold and experimental by trying a bit of reggae on Jamaica. But at the time, in the cold light of day when the album came out, you just thought, hang on a minute, what are these guys playing at?
They could chuck in things like the crunge and Jamaica for fun, and I appreciate them doing it. Perhaps somebody else might think they were fillers, but I think they're great tracks. My favourite track on that album is actually The Ocean, which we play live, and there's a superb version on the How the West Was Won live version of it, which we copy as closely as we can. The drummer enjoys himself on that one. It's just a fantastic track.
The title was inspired by the fact that Zeppelin at this point were playing bigger and bigger venues, obviously, particularly in the States, the typical American enormo domes, and I think Robert Plant described them because they were just so big as the houses of the holy, as if they were sort of giant cathedrals.
It reflects in tracks like The Ocean, for example, which Plant, basically the theme of the song lyrically is about, those sea of faces that he's looking out at now, the ever-expanding audience.
The 1973 US tour, which was off the back of the House Holy album, is the tour where Led Zeppelin went from being a very good rock band to a complete rock institution. The first 2 dates in Atlanta and Tampa, they played to 90,000 people. Atlanta was 49,000. The opening day of a US tour, that's a phenomenal amount of people.
Houses of the Holy was a departure from the 4th album, obviously, because it had a title, which is more than we had before, although obviously it didn't have the band's name on the cover, so we were still slightly confused there.
I had a Led Zeppelin calendar given to me, which was all the album covers, which I had hanging up at work. And that particular cover I didn't hang up because in modern times, pictures of naked children perhaps doesn't go down very well at the time because it was very innocent, and in a more 70s drug-induced era, it was probably an interesting album cover. It was something that actually held up the release of the album because they had a lot of trouble with the colour tinting on the cover apparently. It's become an iconic cover, but it's very strange. It's a very odd cover. I'm not quite sure what they were trying to say with that one.
Every album had a feel about it, which again is not something you get nowadays. There was the whole thing with the Houses of the Holy, the cover with the naked girls, crawling up the hill, the mountaintop. What was at the top, the air of mystery, that came through in some of the music, particularly with No Quarter. I think that summarised that whole feel of the album sleeve.
No Quarter is a very dark song. It's a very ominous song, although the ominous aspect never really comes out. It's always very underplayed and very much under the surface, but it bubbles away.
It's the way that that John Paul Jones comes in as the arranger, and he's playing the organ on it. It just allows it to build.
It was John Paul Jones coming into his own within the band in a way that people could really hear. I mean, he's obviously been a highly influential musician in Led Zeppelin. He was the guy that arranged the vast majority of the material, and No Quarter really was his little epic.
He has a point where, it's 1973 and he's using a bass synth and synthesized sounds on the keyboard. The vocal is affected, he basically composed the track in a very synthesized sort of way, and prior to them recording, he'd done it sometime before, and then they came into the song. Obviously the lyrics reflect the atmosphere, the mood as well of that.
Close the door, put out the light. They won't be home tonight. Oh, the snow falls hard, and don't you know? The winds of Thor are blowing cold.
Page treated his guitar in such a way that it sounded very weird, and it emphasised the sort of lyrics of the song. They choose the path where no one goes, the endless journey, the quest to get home. All that atmosphere, made it a very outstandingly different track to what they'd done.
It's really, really kind of creepy and foreboding. It's almost like something Black Sabbath might have done in one of their early albums, you know. So that's a real high point, and I think that's what lends to the fragmented nature of Houses of the Holy. You know, you come off the reggae beats and then you get No Quarter, and you think, Jesus, you know, Zeppelin are bang back on form again.
Whoa, yeah! Whoa, yeah! Whoa, whoa!
Jimmy Page in particular felt every album was where they were at that time. So they'd been on the road a long time, they'd been to India, they'd soaked up different influences. One of the tracks on it, the lead track, the song remains the same. It's about their travels across the world. You know, they were soaking up so much of what was going on around them, which I think made the album such a statement.
Houses is a much more personal album. You know, there seems to be an element of you know, reflection of where they were at that particular point.
It is the springtime of my loving, the second season I am to know. You are the sunlight in my growing, so little warm I felt before.
It's got the angular riffs, it's got Jimmy Page at his peak still, particularly Dancing Days is an obvious one, Song Remains the Same. But there's lighter stuff, you know, you've got the Rain song, which is like a pastoral symphony. Very different to anything they'd done before.
The Rain song itself is a beautifully flowing, almost ethereal, evocative, folky piece. It's so well presented, you can actually have the vision in your mind of the country, the English countryside. It's a very English song.
Houses capitalise on, you know, more orchestrated sounds, synth sounds, instead of staying in a very sort of guitar-oriented format.
It's an album by a band that have been around the world several times, shagged a lot of girls, taken a lot of drugs, and you know, this was them looking back at the last few years.
As the success grew, as the audiences grew, I think their arrogance grew as well, and it would do. They were, you know, mid-20s, millionaires, and, you know, you play to 60,000 people, you're not going to switch off the light at the end of the night, you know, and go to bed. You're going to have a good time. And Led Zeppelin knew how to have a good time.
Led Zeppelin take things to excess off stage?
Peter Grant went up to Bob Dylan backstage in the mid-70s and introduced himself as Led Zeppelin manager, and Bob Dylan said, "I don't come to you with my problems, so don't come to me with yours."
One could say that they leaned in that direction at times when the fancy took them, which was quite possibly more than once or twice.
The drugs are there, the women are there. Who wouldn't do it?
You see, this is it. The children have to play. And when the world is your oyster, you might open a shell or two.
They would and could hire out an entire floor of a hotel for themselves and then just party there.
Led Zeppelin never debunked the myths at all. They allowed the myths to carry on, which means to this day, a quarter of a century after they split up, the myths are still as enormous as they were at that time.
They personified everything that we now perceive to be, you know, either from a cliched piss tape point of view, the Spinal Tap thing, or the serious, balls out rock and roll thing. You know, these guys invented the rock and roll rule book.
Led Zeppelin, above everything, above the myths, above the road fever, the excesses, was about the music. And that is what fueled the success and fueled their motivation to go out and play those songs live to that amount of people. It was never just about, let's just have a good time. It had to be, let's move on. Once we get in, you know, to the studio, let's creatively move on.
Take my body home.
You don't get as big as Led Zeppelin unless you've got that belief in yourself. It's not arrogance, it was belief, and they, you know, believed, and to believe they must know. They knew how good they were, they knew how big they were going to be.
And were huge by the time that Physical Graffiti came out. It was an album people have waited for a long time. And when it came out, I don't think it disappointed very many people.
Bearing in mind, in my view, the comparative disappointment of Houses of the Holy in comparison to its predecessor, Zep 4, suddenly Zeppelin come back on form with this just really, really daunting, powerful, moody, mesmerising project called Physical Graffiti.
The 8 tracks they got for their 6th album, as it was going to be, were too long for the old vinyl album. I think it clocked in about 53 minutes, something like that. So the idea was, do we shelve a couple of the tracks? Didn't really want to, they're all quality. Or do we go with a double album?
Just over 50% of the stuff is new, and some of the stuff is old, crazy stuff, you know, really good stuff that we thought we can't keep it in the can any longer, let's put it out, you know. Yeah. So it's about 50-50.
If somebody said that they'd never listened to Zeppelin, I'd sit them down to Physical Graffiti. They'd have to sit through all of it. It's a double album. But the diversity of material on that is just fantastic, and it has got some of the most brilliant tracks on it.
We did it in different stages. I should say altogether the new stuff took about 4 or 5 months, you know, but nothing was, there was no continuous work employed at all. You know, we worked so long, and then suddenly we feel maybe we should take a rest for a bit. In fact, that's Led Zeppelin, really.
The tracks that really define what Led Zeppelin are all about, if you needed to explain to someone who had no idea who or what they were, if you just played them Custard Pie, Kashmir, In My Time of Dying, it would tell you everything you need to know.
Zeppelin, I think, just pulled it off. You know, they just had 2 albums worth of material, and each song was just fantastic. And the overall atmosphere that permeated Physical Graffiti was something else as well. It was a very consistent, very moody album, and the songs flowed. That atmosphere was all pervasive.
It was a representation of what they did best. So there was the best rock tracks, the blues tracks, the light and shade, the acoustic. Every area that up to that point they'd covered was covered well. You got the Eastern influence coming in with Kashmir, you got the esoteric feel of In the Light, and you got the basic rockers, which they could just do in their sleep.
Custard Pie kind of rewrote the rule book of rock and roll, I would say, in however long that is, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. It's just so edgy and on the money. You can see the band just looking at each other in the room. There's such a vibe there. You know, it really defined. It also, I think, defined the sound of a good rock and roll record. It was so perfect.
Led Zeppelin's recordings were, by and large, quite brilliant with Jimmy Page's production. You know, he had a feel for the studio, quite obviously.
Is Jimmy Page one of the best producers in rock and roll ever? Yes. The way that he produced Led Zeppelin is extraordinary, which is one of the reasons that they stand up today, not just because of their individual skills as players, but the way in which Jimmy was able to get that in the recording studio.
You can't forget John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page had spent years as session musicians in back rooms of studios. So they knew their stuff. They knew how to create sounds, arrangements, atmosphere. That was, again, a key element of an album like Physical Graffiti, was the vibe.
Physical Graffiti is just a very good example of how they knew to pace a record and how their songs worked against each other.
Every track just seemed to build and build and build in intensity. All right, it had its soft moments, had its bronnier moments, if you like, but it was that insistency, you know, that intensity, I think, that carried it through, you know, from side one right through to side four.
At the end of a gig, if we haven't played Stairway, people shout out for it, but the number they shout out for most is Kashmir, which of course is possibly the standout track of the album.
Kashmir's one of the best on there. I think for a lot of big Zepp fans, it's probably the all-time best Zepp track.
Stairway to Heaven's just penetrated everything from movies to you name it, to advertising and stuff. But Kashmir is a step further. It's much more of an orchestrated piece.
It's got a great melody, which everybody remembers. Robert Plant is chanting rather than singing, and it's the way that it actually sort of is allowed to roll through. There is no sense of rush, there's no sense of being extended or elongated, and over the years it's become such a catchphrase for everything in Eastern inspiration through rock.
It's a very strange world Robert Plant was driving through when he wrote that song in Morocco. You know, he went on this long journey, I think that took him 2 days just down a straight road, and that's the original song was called Driving to Kashmir. You know, there's so much vibe in that record. It's dark, actually. The lyrics are, I think, quite optimistic, a lot of them, but the vibe of the record is just dark.
They'd somehow, and I still don't know how they've done it to this day, they've amalgamated that very, very atmospheric Middle Eastern feel into a song of enormous power.
They brought in brass players and like a horn section and string players. You know, they'd never used session musicians or really thought about that before.
Kashmir is interesting for several reasons. It's got really only 2 riffs in it, but you've also got John Paul Jones's fantastic horn and orchestra violin arrangements on it as well. The main riff, the feel of the main riff, is what's been copied the most, which is the famous which is great to play live, because if people don't realise it's a different tuning, they get really confused watching your hand, because they can't work out what you're doing. And the second riff, which is the descending part, is this. really only those two parts in it. There's an intermission riff, but the whole thing is built around that. And I think, as I mentioned before, it's the pulse of John Bonham's drumming all the way through that keeps pulling back the feel of the track.
Brilliant production as well from Jimmy Page. It's very basic, the production. It could have easily been overloaded with things, but it wasn't. It was allowed to be what it should be. Again, serendipity played its part. Another time, another studio, another album, maybe it would have been overbalanced. This time it works brilliantly.
Looking for a track from Led Zeppelin that would silence critics and go, yeah. I mean, they've got their moments, but you know, they're just a bit rock and roll, really. You know, here was a track that couldn't be missed for its dynamic, you know, intent.
If there's any album that says this is Led Zeppelin, that's the one.
Had Led Zeppelin's career finished with Physical Graffiti, in some respects it might have been a perfect place to end, because the only way seemed to be down after that.
The tour began in the States in 1975, and again, massive tour, 2 legs, again playing huge places. Got to the point where now, if they booked the Los Angeles Forum, it wasn't going to be 2 nights, it wasn't going to be 3, it was 5, it was 6. You know, it was, you know, so many people wanted to see them at this point.
They were going through a lot of problems by the mid-70s. I mean, there's a whole myth was growing up about Jimmy Page's fascination with Aleister Crowley and black magic and dabbling in that aspect, and the way that bad karma was starting to affect the band. And in 1975, when Robert Plant had a car crash when he was with his wife at the time, Maureen, on roads in Greece, people suddenly were talking about, oh, that's it, the bad karma's starting to hit home. And they had to actually push back the recording of Presence a little bit because of that car crash.
Robert Plant and Jimmy Page composed a lot of the material while in Malibu or Hawaii or somewhere while he was recuperating from the accident. You know, so they were in a nice, mellow environment, but very different to where they'd been before. Then they went into rehearsals, and Plant was, you know, sitting in an armchair with his leg up, you know, singing, and even he said it was just so odd to be with Zeppelin, like in this armchair, trying to, you know, deliver.
It's interesting, Presence. That's the album that it was the first album to enter into the bargain bins, apparently, in the record shops. I think it's a really bad press. It's an interesting album because it was made under enormous pressure. Robert Plant was recovering from the car accident he had, and you can tell it's really Jimmy Page working flat out. It's Jimmy Page's album.
Jimmy Page took a greater control over it. A lot of the compositioning was his, production was his, and he said himself, this album is us with our backs against the wall screaming really loudly, was his quote. So there's a power from the album.
Any album that opens up with an 11-minute long track called Achilles' Last Stand, that is just this enormous swirling rock and roll statement. How can you not like that?
I think Achilles' Last Stand, had it been written earlier, and who knows, maybe it was, but it actually would have fitted in very, very well with the material that was on side 1 and 2 of Physical Graffiti. It had that sort of very full, vibrant sound that Led Zeppelin managed to achieve, really from House of the Holy onwards.
It's a fully orchestrated track. It's again one of those sort of epic Kashmiri type tracks. Stairway to Heaven. It's in its length and its whole shape and colour.
The urgency of the playing in that album, the questioning, you know, of the lyrics, the lyrical content is very questionable. Plant saying, well, you know, I've got this far, and yet, you know, it can all stop within seconds. You know, we're at the top of the tree and suddenly I have a car crash and everything stopped. And I think that changed a lot of his thinking. Out of that worrying period, they came back stronger. And Presence, if you listen to it in that context, is a very emotional and a very powerful, edgy record.
When you realise the studio pressure they were under, he did the overdubs in incredibly fast time. You can almost hear the urgency in the tracks.
The sound of Presence is slightly rawer, but it was recorded over a much shorter period of time than Physical Graffiti was. But yeah, I mean, it's back down to a single album, and even though you open with like an 11-minute song, the songs are starting to get shorter. It is almost as if they're aware of the changing kind of mood of music, and even though it's very majestic all the way through, and just very, very Zeppelin, it's quite raw and it does rock.
The standout track for me that's really, really underrated is I think it's the closing track on the album. It's called T for One, and you've got plants, and it's very difficult to conjure up the image, but ostensibly recording most of the album confined to a wheelchair at that point. And his vocal performance on that song is just so pained and passionate that you can kind of feel what he's going through at that point.
It's a track, if you sit down and play one blues track that Led Zeppelin's done, or if I had to pick one blues track as something that's very, very easy to listen to, but also got a very exciting feel, it's T for One. And it's got bits of almost everything in there. Classic track. Although it was quite different than anything else Led Zepp were doing on, or at that period of time with Presence.
You can hear on the record that the band was starting to go into a creative decline. I don't think they were creative declining. I think they were looking for new areas and new fresh sense of direction. And what Presence gave them was some interesting moments like Candy Store Rock, which I think is a fascinating sense of the blues. T for One, which is very underrated. It's a really good song if you listen to it. And Nobody's Fault But Mine. I mean, and you add in Achilles' Last Stand, which is not far behind the giant epics of Led Zeppelin's past in terms of stature. And it is still a very good album.
Any other band would be delighted to have made Presence, but I think with Led Zeppelin, maybe it isn't seen as one of the real classics.
If you say it's a weak album, it's got Achilles' Last Stand on it, which is a phenomenal track. It's got Nobody's Fault But Mine on it, which is incredible. It's I think it's an amazing album.
With Presence, they couldn't tour immediately because Robert wasn't fit, which is where then, in the scheme of things, the movie is released and gave them, some breathing ground.
Peter Grant was a very savvy manager. He didn't want Led Zeppelin disappearing for a year. So, hey, out came this, what is now perceived as a pretty poor film.
I mean, if you just take it as a film, then much like Ken Russell's version of The Who's Tommy, it's not a very good movie. However, it's got Led Zeppelin live on it, and even the fantasy sequences that each member of the band played out, no matter how risible they may appear today, Zeppelin fans were buying into that.
It is the summer of my smiles. Flee from me, keepers.
I can remember going to see it. I was probably 17, 18 going to see it. Not the first time round, I hasten to add. I'm not that old. I thought the fantasy sequences were just bizarre.
They wanted to combine something that was footage on the road trip as it were, with something that gave an insight into their lives and into how they felt as people. So the five of them, and I'm including Peter Grant here, were given the opportunity to really act out their fantasies on screen.
It was a bit Monty Python, really, I think, when it first came out. But now I think you just think, God, what are these guys on? You know, how do they think they could get away with it?
I went with a view to trying to find out how they played various things, and some of the most intricate guitar pieces, it suddenly goes off in some strange fantasy sequences, so I was quite disappointed.
Spinal Tap did it better, you know, it's that sort of film. It did, at times it did make them look mildly silly.
Plant thought he was a fantasy warrior with a broadsword. He really did, you know, and you tend to believe it.
It didn't come out till 1976. The gig they were filmed at Madison Square Garden had occurred 3 years earlier.
Having never seen Zeppelin, of course, it was that was the nearest I was ever going to get, so I sat there quite transfixed through it, if disappointed.
You need cooling, woman, I ain't fooling. I'm gonna send you back to school.
Subsequently, the band have admitted that it wasn't their greatest performance of all time. So that kind of came across, I think, you know, obviously they'd invested a lot of money in recording these shows, and they were probably locked into the whole, you know, snowballing effect of getting this bloody live thing out.
Page mixed what was there. The soundtrack to the movie wasn't perfect, certainly as far as he was concerned, and his performance. But there it stands as it was. And from my point of view, I think that's why I think that the film and the album works, because that's the real deal. You know, so I love the honesty of it. I love the honesty of that.
The film, I think, stands up a lot better now than it did back then, but purely probably because it's now more of a curio than a overblown celebration of Zeppelin.
It was the first time Led Zeppelin had really made a wrong move.
It filled the gap before the 77 tour.
You're going to tell me that I bet it wouldn't happen in Europe.
I don't know
or in
how
England.
the guy got in the building. This isn't Europe or England.
No, I can see
The
that
thing that
because it's so
happened.
inefficient.
The movie actually did display, especially Peter Grant, being very much the man who protected and defended his band, but would do so at the expense of anybody else.
I don't think they'd ever have been as successful if they hadn't have had Grant. I mean, he opened a lot of doors, literally. I think he kicked in a lot of doors, apparently.
He and Jimmy had had a close relationship that had built up through the Yardbirds, Peter looking after the tail end of the Yardbirds. And Jimmy and Peter Grant worked together very, very closely. And Peter loved Jimmy, and then secondly, he loved Led Zeppelin. In a platonic way, of course, ladies and gentlemen.
They're famous, of course, for earning an amount of money, but holding on to an amount of money, mainly because I don't think anyone would argue with Grant. And there's stories of them being paid in cash, and this huge man pushing in the door and saying, right, we'll have the money now, sort of thing. I don't think he said, we'll have the money now, please, but no one would argue with him.
He changed the rules of rock and roll management. Suddenly, shock horror, the band were getting the majority of the money.
They upped the percentage rate so that they got an enormous amount of money. And it pissed the promoters off, but they had no option because, you know, Zeppelin were the biggest band in the world. If they were going to go on tour, the promoters had to get them. So it really was a no-lose situation for Zeppelin.
That time in America in 1977, no act had got as big as they had got. They just hadn't. I mean, you had to really be there and understand what it was about being on tour in that year. You know, they swept the country, but backstage, it was getting out of hand. And I think the arrogance of Led Zeppelin could have cost them dear.
What happened in America with Billy Graham, who was the promoter, you know, who brought Zeppelin over, and you know, he was the guy to have doing a show. He was the biggest promoter in America, and after one of their concerts, and the whole thing goes, there was a big argument over someone's son, and Peter Grant was involved, Bonham was involved too. There's Zeppelin, I think a security guy, and one of their techs was involved. There was a huge, big fist, all-out fight outside their dressing room.
And there was an assault case against John Bonham and Peter Grant. And it was getting out of control. I remember Peter Grant, when I spoke to him about this, he looked pretty solemn. Many years later this was, and he looked me in the eye and said, that was something that shouldn't have really happened. It shouldn't have happened. We regret it happened. You know, it was not something we were comfortable with, but it got out of control, and we didn't even realise it was getting out of control.
And then to find out only a couple of days later, the next show, which was pretty low key, you know, because the police and everybody was involved, and you know, this whole thing was going to go further. And then Robert Plant found out that his son, Corich, had died of a stomach infection.
Robert Plant was given the news, and pretty much immediately all Led Zeppelin activity was curtailed for the next year. Really, everything was put on hold while Robert Plant kind of dealt with this. I think he sort of went away and became a lot more reflective.
John Bonham, who, you know, is Plant's lifelong, you know, friend and was, coaxed him back into it, really. I think it was John Bonham who was instrumental in keeping Robert in touch and eventually saying, what are you going to do? I think Plant did think at one point about doing something else. He mentions that, you know, he thought about being a teacher. But it did come back, thankfully, and they regrouped in 1978 for another album, and it was all back on.
And I think they made the right decision to continue, because otherwise it would have been a case of what would have happened, what could we have achieved. You know, I think they were at a point where they were still pushing boundaries.
When they regrouped and started Into the Outdoor, a lot of people felt something had gone out of the band. And you listen to Into the Outdoor, and there are people who regard it as their weak point.
When it first came out, I just thought it was an album of outtakes, to be honest with you. I didn't really realise it was a new album.
It wasn't recorded in Britain or America. It was actually recorded in ABBA's Polar Studios in Stockholm.
I'd love to know what the real story is behind the album, because if Presence was Jimmy Page's album, Into the Outdoor no doubt was John Paul Jones's album, and it's incredibly keyboard led. And if you listen to all the tracks, the guitar's actually quite back in the mix, and Jimmy Page is the guy on the desk. Now, I don't know what personal or health problems he was having at the time. I certainly wouldn't like to comment on tape or camera, but you feel he was taking almost a back seat.
Jimmy was going through huge drug problems. I don't think it's any secret at that point. The motivation for Page, because of his health, wasn't really there. So what you find him with that album, it's not a Jimmy Page album, it's a John Paul Jones album.
John Paul Jones got his keyboards back out for the album. I think he was strictly on bass for the preceding record, Presence, which lends it, you know, a slightly more lightweight feel.
There are some ideas on In Through the Outdoor that don't quite work. It's got more sort of synthesizer kind of sounds on it, which would have been a bit alien to a lot of sort of Zepp fans.
It's a much more light-hearted record, I'd say, and it's less straight-out rock and roll. You know, they're stretching out into a lot of other territories.
In the Evening, Carousel Umbra, these are pretty good songs. You know, I mean, In the Evening, that's got the whole, that's you know, the sort of the creepy mysticism and then the stomping rock.
We're playing In the Evening, which if you take the guitar riff, is actually a really heavy track.
A very, very good haunting track, typical of the stuff that Zeppelin would use to open a show or open an album. And you saw that with Presence, with Nobody's Fault But Mine. It's in the same vein as that.
I need your love. Ooh, yeah. I need your love.
Again, very sort of almost slightly laid back, late night in a bar with smoke-filled rooms type of atmosphere to them. And there's some very good music on In Through the Outdoor.
They were very aware of the onset of punk, and a lot of these kind of 70s guys were going to land up looking like dinosaurs. They were very aware of that, and so I think they were moving on at that point and were not going to be left behind and looking out of date, really.
They were fascinated by what we now know as world music at the time. And you listen to something like All My Love, which is Robert Plant's song to his late son. And it's a wonderful piece of music. And it really has a sense of emotion and presence in there, as it were.
Yours is the cloth, mine is the hand that sews time. His is the force that lies within. Ours is the fire, all the warmth we can find. He is a feather in the wind. Oh, it's all my love, all of my love, oh, all of my love to you now. All of my love, oh, yes, all of my love to you now.
The standout track is All My Love, which is just so sensitive and so well rendered, and has become, you know, I think quite a little Zeppelin classic in its quiet way. And I think if people take that song in isolation and listen to it, and then you tell them it's off In Through the Outdoor, you'll think, hang on a minute, no, it was on Led Zeppelin 3, it was on Led Zeppelin 4, no, it was on In Through the Outdoor.
All My Love is from Robert's point of view, is a very reflective song. I mean, obviously, you know, coming back and writing lyrically, you know, when you've lost your son, it is, you know, you're not going to sing really upbeat, happy songs a lot. You're going to be in some sort of reflective state.
They used strings in there, and it was technically very, very well put together. And I think today actually they stand out as tracks that are very easy to listen to. They may not be typical Zeppelin or classic Zeppelin, but they're actually more listenable in some ways than some of the earlier material was ever going to be.
Count Alhambra, which is a crazy 11-minute epic in grand Zeppelin style, led by Jonesy, one of his finest moments. He was all over that. So there were good moments on it. Not a complete album, but I think, as I say, it missed Page's, you know, influence.
Yeah, there are a couple of songs on there that, I mean, the Hot Dog, which is, you know, I mean, I love country music, but I don't really want to hear Led Zeppelin tackle country music.
So when you look at this album, In Through the Outdoor, you've got Southbound Sores, not my favourite at all. Fall in the Rain, it's okay. Hot Dog, which is complete and utter rubbish. So you got really 3 bad tracks out of 7.
As an album, I don't think it holds together quite as well as what went before. It's possibly, and this is all comparative, the weakest of Led Zeppelin's studio albums. However, it's still got enough strong moments on it to make it far more than just a throwaway record which marked the end of a career and something to be buried under a carpet.
There isn't a sense of closure about In Through the Outdoor. It is a sound of a band who know who they are, they know what they've done, but they're also aware that if they're going to carry on, they've got to be able to not match what's happening, but move with the times and adapt their sound accordingly.
They were ready to carry on. You know, there was new places to go. And I think Into the Outdoor was a launch pad for what was going to be the next step.
There is a story, a rumour, I don't know if it's true, that after the album, Jimmy Page and John Bonham were saying, we need to make a real rock album now, a real back to Led Zeppelin 4 sort of album. Of course, unfortunately, they never got the chance to do it.
None of them would have realised that when they recorded In Through the Outdoor, it would be the last record that the 4 of them would ever record with each other. You know, no one knew that what happened to John Bonham was going to happen to him.
They booked a month in America to be in the October, and that was going to be the first part of what they were going to call the Led Zeppelin 1980s campaign, and it was going to go into Europe the next year, and then with good plans, and they were going to record an album, and it was all going on. It was, you know, the morale was good, so all that was ready to go, when the rehearsal for the first US dates was set up in Bray Studios, and that's where John Bonham arrives very drunk, and he's plainly not that well, and he's not that fit to play. I think they played for about an hour. They're all staying at Jimmy Page's house in Windsor, and they all went back. John Bonham was put to bed, and that was the end of it. John Paul Jones tells the story that he woke up in the morning. John Bonham hadn't got up. They left until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. John Paul Jones goes up to stir him, no answer, goes in, and he was dead. He was dead. He died, choked on his own vomit.
Well, when John Bonham died, it was just shocking and very sad, and just sad, you know. God bless him.
When John died, there were definitely tremors, you know, felt throughout the music world. Purely because he was just such a fantastic drummer, and indeed created those tremors. You know, when he hit his drum skins. I mean, he's just got such a unique style. To me, always when I listen to him, it just sounds like he's playing drums while he's falling off the edge of a cliff.
John Bonham was certainly the most exciting rock and roll drummer I think there's ever been. He also invented what we now know as heavy rock drumming.
An absolute show-off at what he did, which was part of the magic and the brilliance of his drumming. But technically, he was not a brilliant drummer. He wasn't not brilliant, but he wasn't he wasn't superb. He was big because of the band he was in, but he was more than able to carry it off as well.
He was so integral to Led Zeppelin, so that when he died, and Led Zeppelin basically said, "We're not carrying on," everyone understood.
And then you move into a very strange period where Robert goes off and does some club gigs with the band. Jimmy doesn't know what to do. You know, Jonesy in the end, he always tells the story that when the band stopped, he was up for the school run again. So that's what he did. He just went back to being a family man. And eventually they picked up the pieces and different things happened and they carved some sort of solo careers out, particularly Robert. But then it all changed again at Live Aid.
I think for a band that steadfastly refused to reunite after John's death, to come back for Live Aid, I mean, obviously a fantastic cause to be involved with, but maybe they should have thought, hang on a minute, you know, will this taint the legacy of Zeppelin?
Led Zeppelin didn't play at Live Aid. A group with Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and John Paul Jones played at Live Aid. Wasn't Led Zeppelin.
Phil Collins is a great drummer, but he's about as rock and roll as a wet tissue. It was the whole thing, I think, was a big mistake. I think they were under a lot of pressure to do Live Aid. And I think in the end, Bob Geldof is not a man you can easily say no to.
I think they did a pretty good job considering. And it was all for a good cause, so who can complain?
Page was off key, Plant wasn't singing very well. The whole thing was a mess from beginning to end, and the sooner that's forgotten, the better. It wasn't Led Zeppelin. Admittedly, it was only 5 years Live Aid after Zeppelin split up and John Bonham died, but even by then, they weren't Led Zeppelin anymore. Even by then, they'd grown away from it, and it just did not work.
What they always had was that superb communication between themselves, and to quote Led Zeppelin, I think there was a communication breakdown.
It might have been a little ragged, you know, it might have been a little even stodgy at times, but let's face it, they picked some great tracks, and I don't think any fan complained whatsoever. Just to see the band play 20-odd minutes live was something people thought they'd never see again.
I think that's probably the closest it's been. I mean, there's been many bits and pieces. There's been Page and Plant on their own and stuff, but Plant's right. The moment John Bonham's gone, no Led Zeppelin.
fascinating to hear what they would have come up with if they'd have carried on, certainly for a couple more years. I mean, I'm sure at some point they would have probably all felt, well, this is it, we can't do any more than we've done, go our separate ways. But I think that's something that's possibly haunted Jimmy Page more than anyone else.
If you listen to any of the artists' solo albums, you know, you listen to Robert Plant's solo albums where he's gone on and made quite a number since Zeppelin split up or ended, and Jimmy Page has had sporadic efforts. John Paul Jones has as well, but not one of those solo albums has been anywhere near in the class of any one of the Led Zeppelin albums, and I think it's a classic case of the sum of all the parts made up an absolutely brilliant band.
Sounds caress my ears. No matter what I heard, could I relate? The story was quite clear.
I don't know anybody in the US who wouldn't hail them as the definitive band. Absolutely. And I mean, in some quarters they are the heavy metal band. You know, I'm sure they hate that. But they were the template.
Zeppelin are often called a heavy metal band, which is completely wrong. They're just a really, really awesome, powerful rock band.
The band were brilliant live. The band had their moments of brilliance in the studio, but in many cases they were grossly overrated as the super hyped, brilliant band. There were other bands that were just as good, if not better.
They're not the most influential band, they're the most influential rock band. So they wrote the rules and defined the rules for rock and roll in the 70s. In 100 years' time, you want to know what rock and roll is, this is it. You basically play people 3 or 4 Led Zeppelin albums, that's rock and roll.